Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this rainy evening. I'm Grace Law, Chair of the Department of Architecture here at the GSD. And I'd like to thank the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that you see up there that led to the acknowledgement that you see there above. A quick reminder that we have live caption available tonight for our virtual audience. And to enable that captioning, you have to click the closed caption button on the bottom of the live stream window. And for our in-person audience, there's also live captioning available at the link or QR code that you see here on the screen. Please visit the AV booth if you need assistance. And then just a few announcements. Tomorrow, March 29th, Joel Sanders and the GSD student group Queer in Design will present a noontime lecture in the Loeb Library. So for more information about that, please visit the GSD's website, as well as for upcoming programming and events. So tonight's event marks the 4th annual John Hejduk Soundings Lecture. And this lectureship honors the legacy of John Q. Hejduk, MArch 53, through an annual interdisciplinary lecture. Among the notable aspects of Hejduk's legacy is how he shaped generations of pedagogy and design thinking through his association with the Texas Rangers, his teaching at UT Austin and then Cornell, and at Cooper Union from 1964 to 2000. Where his formal analysis assignments and combinatorial problems, such as, for example, the 9-square grid, might be understood as proto-computational. It's in this spirit this evening that we're really very delighted to welcome Mario Carpo, who is an architectural historian and critic, currently the Rayner Banham Professor of Architectural History and Theory at the Bartlett UCL, and Emeritus Professor of Architectural Theory at Die Angewandte, the Institute of Architecture of the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. Receiving his architectural education in 1983 from the University of Florence and his PhD in history from the European University Institute in 1990, Mario's educational background overlaps with the final decade of Hejduk's teaching, perhaps in some ways picking up where Hejduk left off. Mario, like Hejduk, has had a profound impact on architectural pedagogy as a historian of early modern architecture in academic posts throughout Europe and North America, at the CCA and at the Yale School of Architecture, but also as a critic of contemporary design and technology that have shaped the ways we might understand the influence of design computation, periodizing the first and second digital turns in architecture in 2 seminal books, published in 2012 and 2017, respectively, as well as in a host of other books, including The Alphabet and Algorithm and his most recent book, Beyond Digital: Design and Automation at the End of Modernity. Because here at the GSD, we're not shy to take credit for stimulating discourse, I must mention that Mario is not new to our podium. We invited him to join us as part of a 2012 panel, The Eclipse of Beauty, Parametric Beauty, and again in 2014, Adaptive Technologies, Computation's Deep Ancestry. On these occasions, the conversations questioned the way that the computer invokes efficiency, performance, optimization, extremes that, if not determinative of beauty, nevertheless evoke virtuosity, and how we grapple with the resonance and conflict between design and exact science. Indeed, it seems we call on Mario in moments of deep questioning, as we now contend with the pressing topic of design computation, generative AI, about which we will hear his thoughts on the potency and pitfalls of imitation. In a moment when the Academy is questioning the very use of precedents as a heuristic tool, in part because it is impossible to decouple precedents from their socio-political inception, Mario has asked, how might we re-engage with imitation and style in critical, interpretive, and creative terms? Without a doubt, the explosion of ChatGPT has awakened the realization of generative AI's potential. Our brethren down the street are quick to note that simpler versions of generative AI were introduced as early as 1906, when Andrei Markov, a Russian mathematician, presented his statistical method to predict the next word in a sentence by looking at previous words. This is known as the Markov chain. The difference between ChatGPT and newer forms of machine learning, however, is that they are training on enormous amounts of data, a massive corpus of texts, imagery, and precedents, fed by the internet or claimed by data reapers. The powerful cognitive influence of precedents was not lost on me recently as a student on our studio trip to Copenhagen was mesmerized to see Jorn Utsen's church in person, recalling its plan and section by memory, having trained on its partie in his undergraduate studies at Cornell. To this, Mario has aptly synopsized that every canon is a data set and every data set is a canon. Since the 1950s, computer scientists have long cautioned society with their well-known adage, GI-GO, that is, garbage in, garbage out. This dictum reverberates within our discipline's own urgent, yet at times myopic, calls to decolonize the canon. As a thought exercise, wouldn't it be fascinating not to eschew form, but rather to imagine the powerful commingling of precedent alongside formal analysis, to perhaps resurrect Hejduk's early assignment in a fresh, really fresh, redevised light? After all, the term analysis means a breaking up or an untying, from the root ana, which is up, throughout, and lysis, which is loosening. The etymology reveals the necessary foundational consideration of creative inputs. However, how might we deal with the weight of history and analysis in our computational present? Mario perceptively notes in his Log 58 essay that shares the title of this evening's talk. He states, artificial intelligence today obliges us to deal with precedent, but we no longer know how to do that. So on this note of both urgency and hope, compelling us to confront form, the canon, and computation, please join me in welcoming Mario Carpo to the GSD. Thank you.
A great introduction. Thank you, Grace, for the invitation and for this great introduction. You almost already said almost all I have to say. So. But first thing I have to do is to change my glasses because I have to read my paper, which means that from now on I don't see you anymore. But so long as you still see me, that's okay. I think it works that way. So, again, thanks. And let me start by stating the obvious. Since the summer of 2022, we have all been obsessed with generative AI. First, because nobody had seen it coming. Almost nobody. Some colleagues of mine had, but full disclosure, I didn't. So for me, it was a surprise. Second, some find it promising, many find it frightening. Never mind that for the time being, what generative AI can do amounts practically to almost nothing. But above and beyond all that, I have a feeling that there may be something else going on with generative AI right now. Something strange, creepy, sneaky, yet pervasive and potentially momentous. In short, in 2 lines, just as an introduction, put it on the table. Generative AI, in my opinion, is reviving some very old, actually ancestral art theories and ideas which we thought we had successfully eliminated from contemporary art and design and for very good reasons. This is my topic tonight. And this is a story that started a long time ago, so let me start from the beginning, from the ancients, capital A, whereby we mean the European ancients, or to be precise, the Mediterranean ancients. Now, these ancients, the ancients of classical antiquity, did not have theories on what we now call the fine arts, where we moderns have formulated aesthetic principles on the modes and function of imitation in painting, sculpture, and architecture. The Greek only had some fancy tales, anecdotes, myths, topoi, parables, telling how some craftsmen, on some occasions, managed to make stuff that looked natural, as if made by nature. You see what my sources are. Mimesis, or, well, in English now it's mimesis, but originally it was mimesis. Mimesis, imitation of nature. That was the purpose of classical art, mimesis. So we know, for example, that the famous, that's a problem, famous Greek painter called Zeuxis, but in American it's pronounced Zeuxis. The spelling is Z-U-X-I-S, Zeuxis. In German it's Zeuxis. That's him, Zeuxis. That famous guy once painted grapes that were so lifelike that birds came down to peck at them. So you see what's happening. That's the painting. The birds, being birds and not particularly smart, they come and try to eat the painted grapes. When they find they're painted, they're disappointed. But this proved that he was a good painter because he was cheating the birds. Now, his rival called Parrhasius, I don't know how to pronounce it, but that's Parrhasius, he once won the first prize in a painter context by drawing a curtain that Zeuxis himself was tricked into attempting to pull aside, on which occasion he admitted defeat and came in second. You see how the episodes, both of them in this engraving from the 17th century, on the right there is Zeuxis' submission. So there are the grapes and the birds trying to peck at them. That was the competition. Then Zeuxis turns and says, and you, Parrhasius, what did you paint? And Parrhasius said, well, my painting is here behind the curtain. And then Zeuxis tried to pull the curtain, and the curtain is painted. So that was Zeuxis' conclusion, syllogism, that what the Greek were good at. Say, wait, I cheated the birds, and you cheated me. I am smarter than the birds, so you are a better painter than me, which is why he admitted defeat and came in second. Now, this is about what they meant by mimesis. But the same Zeuxis also figures in another quite different story, illustrated by the same Joachim von Sandrart. He had been invited to a town in what would now be the south of Italy to paint a picture of a goddess who was meant to be a model of perfect beauty. I forgot which goddess she was. Zeuxis went there, set up his shop, and in search of inspiration, he asked to see some example of local beauties. The town elders showed him a selected group of handsome young men. Zeuxis protested. He was then allowed to see some girls. But finding none of them up to the task, he retained 5 of them as models. His painting was a fusion, a blend, an assemblage of features taken from all 5. And it met with great success, hence the lasting popularity of the anecdote, which has been retold and illustrated many times, particularly in the Renaissance and in late Victorian times. Seen today, some of these paintings, actually all of them, even when by old masters, quote unquote, make us uncomfortable due to their evident sexism. This is, for example, what Vasari painted in his own house in Florence, Borgo Santa Croce. And as you see, the story is the story of a fully dressed man looking at a group of naked women. But let's not presume that we are the first to realize that this is and was always seen as a very questionable, deplorable story. This is, for example, the take of Angelika Kaufmann. You know the story. She was a child prodigy. She was born in a little village in Switzerland. She grew up in a little village in Austria. Then she went to, and she was a genius. She spoke 6 languages at the age of 15. And then she went to Rome. She befriended Canova. And then she went to London. And she became the first, or possibly the second, member of the Royal Academy. And by the way, there is an exhibition on her at the Royal Academy right now. And this is her take on the story. And you will see that there are only 4 girls being taken as model by Zeuxis. Model number 5, it's a self-portrait of Angelika herself on the right-hand side. And she is stealing the painter's brush, hence indicating that she would like to be a fully dressed painter and not a naked model. This was 1778. From the point of view of art theory, however, and even of the theory of human knowledge, this Zeuxis tale conceals a number of major theoretical problems. First objection: if Zeuxis already had an idea of perfect beauty in his mind, why did he need to imitate any real-life models? Objection number 2. If, on the contrary, he did not have an innate idea of beauty, how could he choose among so many incomplete manifestations of the ideal? The conflict between realism and idealism in the arts has found different solutions throughout the ages. From a more practical point of view, however, the technicalities of Zeuxis' mode of artistic operation, the selection and the reassembly of parts coming from many models, have equally invited a never-ending stream of theories and speculations. Evidently, the artist would not have limited himself in that instance to just cutting and pasting a number of pieces, as in a puzzle. He would most likely have had to rework, modify, and adapt some of the parts, not only to chip off the edges, but also more generally to make them blend with one another and merge in a single composition. Hence the question: how much of Zeuxis' operation was what we would call today a collage, and how much of it would have been some looser, more creative form of imitation, the work of a talented artist, only vaguely inspired by some of his model or sources? Could people look at this finished painting and tell, see, these are the eyes of model 1, the nose of model 2, and the lips of model 3? Or did he blend all of these sources in one transfigured, literally supernatural composition, where one would say, see, there is a certain something, a certain undefinable typo, something in this portrait that reminds me of all the models, but I cannot tell what precisely comes from each. In classical art theory, this would have been seen as the best way, because that's the way nature itself works. For example, this is the way children may look like one or the other, or even both, or their parents. Another metaphor that was frequently invoked in this context was that of the bee, which makes honey by picking the pollen of many flowers. But pollen is transformed by the bee's industry. So in the end, the honey we get out of the beehive doesn't show any visible trace of the sources from which it derives. All its ingredients have been transfigured by the bee's creative process. This, according to classical theory, is what creative artists do. Creative artists absorb, transform, and transfigure their sources. and made something new out of them, where the new whole is better than any of the original parts. This is what the ancients called creative imitation. Imitation that creates something new, and at the same time, a creation that imitates something old. These classical principles acquired new urgency during the Renaissance, an entire civilization that aimed at the revival of the classical world, a revival to be obtained by way of an intelligent or creative imitation of the classical past. Imitation was the core paradigm of Renaissance culture, the foundation of all its sciences and arts and life, with the exception of religion, where classical antiquity did not offer a good example to modern Christians. Strange as it may appear today, at the start of what we still call the European modern era, a humanist, capital H, was a scholar specializing in the imitation of Cicero's Latin, meaning the imitation of the way of writing of an author who had been dead for 15 centuries, writing in a language that nobody spoke anymore. Likewise, Renaissance architects designed buildings that had to look ancient, and their ancient look was obtained by dint of a creative imitation of classical buildings, or what remained of them. And this is where Renaissance artists were more or less obliged to invent a new mode, a new practice of imitation. Today we would say imitation 2.0 or imitation 2.0. Renaissance artists learned to imitate the form of an artistic model, but only its form without its content. For example, they started to imitate Cicero's writing while expressing new ideas that could not have existed in Cicero's time. And architects imitated classical architecture while designing building types that did not even exist in classical time. Christian churches, for example. This is a famous early attempt, Alberti building a church in the ancient way. But how can you build a church in the ancient way, since the ancients did not build churches? So what Alberti did is, he did in this case really a collage. The pediment is a Greek temple. The lower part of the facade is a Roman triumphal arch. And if you go in, originally you should have seen something which nobody had ever seen, and he explained it was the Tuscan temple according to Vitruvius, which of course nobody knew what it was. Even at the time, contemporaries of Alberti found that this was a bit over the top, which is the reason why Alberti, until very recently, had a reputation of a great thinker, an excellent writer, but a terrible architect. This changed in the 80s, but that's another story. This new mode of imitation, little by little, became, over time, first inadvertently, then more explicitly, the transference of form through different contents. Renaissance artists and scholars didn't conceptualize this operation until Vasari, already mentioned, found a way to name it. And he came up with a term to evoke this ineffable quintessence infused into and common to very different artworks, something which could be transferred between artworks. He called it the manner, in the original maniera. Manner is a certain something that different works of art have in common. It's a feeling, a flair, a generic, pervasive, diffuse, but undefinable aura. In the 18th century, the term taste was adopted with similar meanings, and in the 19th century, the term style took over and replaced all others. So there you go. As of the 19th century, in European art, style is the term used to define a look, an aura, an undefinable something that different works of art have in common. In this sense, with these meanings, imitation and style were, in the 19th century, the backbone of academic training in the arts. This is what artists learned when they went to school. This is what they specialized in: imitation and style. Imitation of the works of the masters, scholarly mastery of the style of an age or of a place. And in the 19th century, as we know, time and place became nation and race. That became the core of the classical tradition in the visual arts: imitation and style, styles of times and places, styles of nations and races. That was the foundation of modern art history: imitation and style. In architecture, starting with Heinrich Hübsch, 1828, in what style should we build? And then continuing famously with Gottfried Semper, the style in the technical and tectonical arts, and Alois Riegel, 1903, and beyond. And I do not need to tell you that this is what modernism eliminated from the arts and design of the 20th century. There are many good reasons why modern artists, designers in particular, felt averse to the ideas of imitation and style that had dominated 19th century European art theory. First, simple argument: if form follows function, then the imitation of traditional forms in the absence of the original function is a wasteful mistake, or worse. From a modernist vantage point, the Victorian battle of the styles was the epitome of all that had gone wrong in architecture since the style of the Industrial Revolution. Unrelated, but often leading to similar consequences, the Romantic artist doesn't follow precedent or nature. Visionary geniuses like Howard Rourke, for example, they do not imitate. In Ayn Rand's words, only the parasite imitate. The true artist just creates. He closes his eyes and invents new things that make sense only to himself, out of nothing and against all, as impersonated by Gary Cooper in 1949. Yet, the founding fathers of architectural modernism did not eliminate the notion of style altogether. Corb, for example, aimed at creating a new architectural style. And in 1932, famously in America, modernism itself became a style, an international one. An all-out crusade against styles seems to have been an ideological project of late modernism, climaxing in the 70s and 80s. This is when all imitation came to be seen as identical copy, hence plagiarism, hence larceny, and a crime. This is when art theory and literary criticism had to bring in a panoply of synonyms, circumlocutions, euphemisms, to refer to the same, now unmentionable notional field: inspiration, influence, often associated with anxiety, at 1973, sensibility, inclination, affinity, etc., etc. The history of the demotion of ideas of imitation and style from 20th century art theory is a fascinating one, and it does admit a few exceptions. First of all, a different mode of imitation based not on merger, fusion, and transfiguration, but on collage, cut and paste, and aggregation, existed as an alternative to the dominant style of smooth transfiguration from the very start, from the Renaissance. This is probably one reason why Bob Venturi liked this so much. It was taken over and reconceptualized by modernist art theory in the 20th century. Picasso, Braque, Greece. Then in architecture by deconstructivism, and to some extent by postmodernism, when it merged with the post-structuralist theory of intertextuality. But this would be another story. So let's forget about this for the time being and focus on the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that in the late 20th century, in the theory of the visual arts and of architecture, imitation and style were forbidden words. For example, if I had mentioned either of these two terms when I was a student, I would probably have been thrown out of a window or just kicked out of school. Hence, the artistic practices to which imitation and style referred just disappeared because there was no way to mention them, let alone discuss them. There is therefore a certain irony in that the latest avatar of today's electronic technologies is fostering a revival of art theory ideas that 20th century modernism had managed to eliminate from the visual culture of the machine-made environment. This is why I'm telling you this story tonight. Not because I was trained as a classicist, I was in very different times, but because today's AI technology, generative adversarial networks, GAN, and machine learning in particular, are bringing imitation and style back into the practice and theory of the visual arts. This may seem at a glance counterintuitive, but it is happening, which begs the question, how did that happen? Where does this come from? When did this start? This requires a small, brief technical digression, so bear with me for the next 5 minutes. The revolution of machine learning reached the visual arts in the mid-2010s, meaning around 2015, when a new mode of AI called GAN, generative adversarial networks, was found to be particularly suitable to the manipulation of images. GAN art, or art generated by AI, is now a recognized staple of digital art, and its image processing strategies are well known. GAN artists must first of all gather a collection of related images that are pertinent to their project. This dataset is then fed into the machine learning algorithm that ferrets out somehow the commonalities among these images, what these images have in common. The result of this inductive process is a mathematical matrix that computer scientists call a latent space, end quote, which more or less corresponds to what philosophers would call the definition, idea, formula, or quintessence of the original dataset. So for example, if the dataset is composed of images of dogs, the correspondent latent space is what philosophers would call the definition of a dog, explaining with words what a dog is, or the idea of a dog, or an ideal dog, showing the image of a perfect dog. This definition, which today is not verbal, that would be the Aristotelian tradition, not visual, that would be the Neoplatonist tradition, but mathematical and vectorial, can in turn, once we have it, when the latent space is functionalized, it can be applied to different tasks. First, analytic, showing the system a new picture and asking, is this a dog? The system will answer, 75% yes. 2, generative, asking the system to produce realistic images of dogs that do not exist. These are fake dogs. These are not real dogs, they're fake dogs. Or combinatory, asking the system to merge 2 or more data sets in given proportions, producing, for example, pictures of a canine entity that looks 80% dog and 20% coyote. Here it shifts, so on the left is 80% dog and 20% coyote. Then the coyote grows, and on the right-hand side is mostly coyote. It shows really a coyote, 80%. The tidal wave of generative AI that has swept the planet since the spring of 2022 has not changed this conceptual framework that much. but it has introduced two important technical innovations. First, the data sets are now composed of text and image pairs, where images are labeled and described with words. Second, these new data sets of text and images are not custom-made, made for a specific project, as was the case with GANs, but they are huge and generic. They are all-purpose data sets, scraped or, in fact, stolen from all possible sources. User-friendly text-to-image or multimodal tools like Midjourney or DALL-E can create images out of verbal or visual prompts as if out of thin air. And their almost supernatural deeds have evidently struck a chord with the general public. But the data set on which they are based derive from vast troves of images, labeled images taken from the public internet, and as such, they can only reflect what the internet has already gathered. In this sense, general-purpose AI tools like those just mentioned only automate crowdsourcing by tapping the same collective knowledge that Wikipedia and other social media apps have been canvassing and soliciting for the last 20 years. Given this context, the almost miraculous images now served on demand by generative AI may be of some use to sociologists or to advertising executives, but they appear at first glance and based on the current state of the art of limited interest to visual artists and designers. Example, if I type the prompt Switzerland into DALL-E, what I get is an automated visual opinion poll. This is what Switzerland looks like in the mind of most people. This may help the Swiss tourist office to design a new website, but that's about it. All the same, the potential of a technology that may one day deliver automated, customized, and minutely controllable images from any combination of verbal queries and visual inputs did not fail to register with the design community, eliciting, as could be expected, just another resurgence of a never-ending human versus machine diatribe. These preoccupations have hidden from sight some very practical consequences of the rise of AI-generated images, which are already being felt in the design professions and in our schools. Machine learning tools based on legacy GANs or the more recent transformers and diffusion models, which are the basis of DALL-E stunts, they are making us used to the way today's artificial intelligence creates images, and they are inducing us to deal with images in similar ways. And how does AI, I mean generative AI, create images? Well, this is the thing. AI-based image making is, at its core, a double exercise in similarities. The first part of the GAN process is analytic. It is about detecting similarities. In the example mentioned above, what do all these carefully selected images of dogs have in common? What visual features make a dog, or in this instance, a subset of the canine universe made only of golden retrievers? This inductive process will create the image of an archetypal dog, never mind what computer scientists call it. The second part of the process is generative. How many variations can we introduce in the image of this ideal dog so that it will be different from its archetype, yet still recognizable as a dog, insofar as it is similar to all the dogs known to the system? The second part of the process, the generative part, is what literally we should call imitation, and was in fact often called that way in the past. The system is imitating its own archetypal dog by creating as many fake dogs as needed. This was a competition for fake dogs. One won a prize, but they are fake dogs. Next step. If we want to imitate two different data sets at the same time to create a hybrid out of two different corpora of images, as in the dog-coyote hybrid, what is it that we can transfer from one image to another, losing some and keeping other of its distinctive features? How do we call the ineffable spirit, the aura, the flavor that characterize the original data set? What's the common feeling that all these images had in common and can be transferred to other content while still being recognizable as a trace or an emanation of the original corpus? In the past, this is what used to be called a style. And in fact, the computer scientist that invented GANs started calling this operation style transfer in 2016. The term has stuck. It is now embedded in some of the most popular GAN and text-to-image applications, as, for example, in Google Deep Dream footnote. This is the old interface of Google Deep Dream. They changed it a few months ago. Now it doesn't look like way anymore. But originally, you see, the spirit of the game was perfectly transparent. You choose a base image, then you choose a style image, and then you transform the image you upload into a style of your own choosing. So since we already had too many dogs, this is a cat. It's not a fake cat. This is a real cat. His name is Robin. It's a good cat. Take my word for it. So we choose a cat, and then we choose a style to transfer it. And we choose not any style. We choose the style, this style. And so this is what Piet Mondrian would have seen Robin. We didn't ask the cat. What if he hasn't seen that? Now, the technical resurrection of the term imitation is more recent. Although imitation learning has long been a recognized branch of artificial intelligence, the term itself gained recognition only in a seminal research paper published by Google DeepMind little more than 1 year ago. Regardless of terminology, visual imitation is what AI-based image-making technologies do, and so do we when we use them. Fortunately, Bob Venturi never had to see this. Given the long tradition of creative imitation in Western art history and theory, it comes as no surprise that the engineers trying to replicate with mathematical means some operation of the human mind felt at some point the instrumental need to call on, resurrect, and revive these two ancient terms. What computer scientists probably did not know is that these two terms, imitation and style, have been out of currency for most of the 20th century, and that artists and art critics trained in the second half of the last century in particular, and to this day, have either avoided them or actively tried to eliminate them. So there you go. AI is bringing back to art practice, if not yet to art theory, notions of imitation and style that modernist ideology had eliminated from the theory and practice of the visual arts throughout most of the 20th century and almost to this day. Imitation and style, which modernist ideology had kicked out of art theory through the door, are coming back to art practice through the window of technology. And while the art historical theories I mentioned all originate from within the classical European tradition, from Renaissance humanism that celebrated imitation, to industrial modernism that eliminated it, today's image-making technologies do not know any such cultural border. They are being largely, often enthusiastically adopted, if not outright developed, in countries that were not colonized by Europe, nor otherwise exposed to European art theories. It is possible, actually quite likely, but the practice of visual imitation was as ubiquitous in pre-industrial cultures outside of Europe as it was in pre-industrial Europe. And it may have survived elsewhere for longer than it did in the West, where, as mentioned, industrial modernism eliminated the theory of creative imitation from the arts and from design of the 20th century. Again, this is not today's topic, so let's leave the matter open for the time being. Be that as it may, and pending this investigation, our problem today remains nonetheless the following. Imitation and style have been absent from most discourse on the visual arts for 2 generations at least. There were many very good reasons why that had to happen. But as a result, we have forgotten, all of us, but particularly in the Eurocentric modernist West, we have all forgotten what imitation is, what it means, how it works. And as technology now automates imitation and obliges us to deal with imitation again, after a century-old oblivion, we urgently need to learn again at least the basics of imitation, in theory and in practice. So when we use technologies that imitate, at least we know what these technologies do and what we do when we use them. Many of us are already using generative AI, or will soon do so, because generative AI can help humans and will soon replace humans in many, or in some design tasks. But above and beyond the practical uses of the tool, generative AI is already affecting the culture, I would say the mindset of the design professions and of the visual arts in general, in a deeper, more pervasive way. Generative AI is a machine that automates imitation. But as it does so, it reminds us of the nature of creative imitation. Imitation is not a copy, it is inspiration. It is not identical replication, it is assimilation and transfiguration. Seen in these terms, imitation is an indispensable component of every creative expression. There is no creation without imitation. Everything we draw is inspired by something we have seen. Everything we write is inspired by something we have read. Everything we say or sing is inspired by something we have heard. Every word we use means something because it has already been used. This is the way the human mind works. And this is the way generative AI appears to work too. A style is a certain undefinable something that different works of art have in common. Even if we can prove that one of those works was made first and all the others followed, there is no way to copyright an influence because we can only copyright a copy. Copyright means right of copy. There is no right of influence. There is no patent or patent on inspiration, no intellectual property of style. When we need to learn something, we go to school or we get training. And for that, we pay tuition fees, not royalties. Teachers who teach architecture in the design studio are paid a salary for the time they spend teaching, not royalties for the permission to look at the buildings they built. If this principle applies to human learning, the same should apply to machine learning, too. More importantly, generative AI, which is a technology, reminds us of the cultural function of precedent in all human communication. When you use AI, all creation is a transfiguration of some precedent of choice, which computer scientists call a dataset. It all starts with a dataset. There is no generation without a dataset. But unrelated to computer science, plenty of theories from Renaissance Ciceronianism to modern structural linguistics have similarly argued that there is no invention without convention, no creativity without a code, no individual expression without a language. Hence, it would appear that for artificial intelligence and human intelligence alike, the first step in every creative process resides in the awareness, acknowledgement, election, selection of our precedent of reference and of our reference to precedent. Precedent, that tradition, that language, that system into which we inscribe ourselves, that canon of our own choosing, that gives meaning to our voice. For this is what generative AI teaches us and what we would remember or should remember when we use it and even when we don't. Every data set is a canon, and every canon is a data set. When we work with pen and paper on our own, we may easily forget that we must have made or chosen our own canon at some point, so we may delude ourselves and think that there is no canon. But with generative AI, there is no way to cheat, because the technical logic of generative AI is brutally transparent. If it works, it is because someone, somewhere, must have made a dataset, chosen a canon. Every dataset is a selection based on preference, our preference or someone else's, even when, in the case of today's large language models, that selection reflects the choices and biases of a corporation, a community, a crowd, or a nation. And we know all too well this day that preference may lead to or come from prejudice. At the start of each creative process, someone must have decided to include something or someone, hence to exclude something or someone. It is as simple as that. This is the teaching of generative AI. We cannot create without a dataset. We cannot escape precedent. Sometimes we can try to tweak it, but more often we must take precedent as it is. And yet, fortunately, there is still one choice we can still and always make. While many may be happy to endorse the canon they are given, we can show that we don't. We can celebrate the canon or make it clear, explicitly clear, that even if we must use that canon, we may not like it. We can, in short, critique the canon. I know it's not easy, but this is what some of us have been doing for quite some while, and some still do. And this is my last word for tonight. Thank you. What happens now? Do we sit there? Sure. You had anticipated most of my conclusion. You had already said it at the start. You stole all my...
Well, I didn't steal it, because actually it felt as I researched it, it seemed actually the questions you raise, we still have a lot of heavy lifting to do, actually, when you think about it. Because if we recognize, well, let me take it back a little bit for just a second, because what I was less anticipating in this talk, when you talk about the combination of style and imitation, it feels like there are some disciplines, for example, the discipline of music, that have never let that go. For example, contemporary training in violin at the New England Conservatory right now still forces all students to play a piece, for example, in the style of Vivaldi, in the style of Paganini. And so that's pretty interesting to me, that there are certain disciplines for which that is actually absolutely foundational, and it remains that way.
It never went away.
It never went away.
Even if Karl-Heinz Stockhausen didn't follow those rules.
Right, right. And even when pedagogues would, let's say, manipulate that as they as they were teaching a particular kind of piece. So I do think that's pretty interesting. So there was no loss of that condition, and I think the result of that is that the virtuosic nature of violinists today are performing in a way that was almost impossible to do. This sort of very self-conscious coalescing of imitation and style is producing violinists that have both technical ability and artistry at an unbelievable in an unbelievable way. And so, I mean, I think it's breathtaking. So now I suppose one of the questions that I have just out of the gate is that, if we assume that we have indeed lost this condition in our own design processes, and we are able to decide creatively what our data sets will be, and then think about the style in which it is occurring, it assumes that we would have some control over the purity of those data sets and maybe the question of the pollution of those data sets as might actually produce some pretty interesting idiosyncrasies. So I think that aren't we actually now at the moment where we need to also understand, or how do we retain discernment? Because discernment seems to be this fundamental condition which we actually don't really have a pedagogy to, we don't have a pedagogy to teach that. And so I suppose that's what I'm wondering about now, because you ask a question, but there's this, to me, there's a question of deep discernment that we don't, it feels
well, this
elusive.
discernment, the point is that imitation was a technique which used to be taught. There were rules and ways to tell good imitation, bad imitation, because the presupposition was that each creation included a certain imitative or mimetic component. This is the criteria that, not with modernism, but with late modernism, we have lost. This is the way my generation was trained. We all knew that to some extent we were imitating, but that is something we could only do without saying, which is why we had to bring in so many synonyms and said the inspiration, the influence, the proximity, the sensibility. But imitation as such was a forbidden word. And with the loss of this clarity of terminology, we have lost the clarity of the operation. And that is my problem. I see that now students are talking about imitation and style again. It is happening. It is happening because if they use that software, these are the terms which they are obliged to deal with. And they don't know where these terms come from. And this is a pedagogical problem. Now, there are many practical consequences. Bringing imitation back as a practical technology for making drawings is already showing up. And this is worrying in many ways. Because if we look at these images from a purely art historical point of view as a way of making images and image theory, that's one story. But this indiscriminate, naive, primitive practice of automatic imitation is already showing up. And this is what we don't teach, because for the last 3 generations, we have lost the tools to do it. This is what I think we need. We need to catch up with what the technology is bringing back to the studios by recuperating some critical categories which until 2 generations ago we all had. And now we don't have anymore. This is a pedagogical problem. Now there are problems in the studios, in the offices, not in the studios, in the school, in offices, because I see what's happening, and this is deeply worrying, but that was not part of my talk.
Well, I suppose another thing that another question that's in my mind, at the turn of the century, and when you look at, for example, the beginnings of large practice, for example, McKim, Mead, and White, and others, I think it's quite astounding to me that there was a production in that firm of over something like 900 buildings. This is before any kind of save as command. And so there is a scenario in which the continual adaptation of very specific stylistic and or imitative conditions is becoming so iterative and so applied that it then becomes a huge body of work, again, before we had any methods to repeat like this. So I'm just thinking about this because in some ways when we look at those buildings, there's a certain kind of, there's a certain kind of perfection of what they were doing, again, through their level of iteration. And I'm wondering about your thoughts now on what would constitute virtuosity in our time now when we think of this condition which would now be automated for us.
Well, when McKim, Mead, and White got there, the classical tradition had been going on for so long that the tools to compose with it were highly sophisticated. And now I think that today generative AI could easily use Vignola indiscriminately. And my guess is someone is probably already doing that. And I wait, it's going to happen. But today we also know that the classical tradition is a bearer of meaning. The classical tradition is not a neutral universal language of, architecture of all times and places. Mm-hmm. It has a heavy ideological baggage with it. And this is what we have to deal with. That tradition exists, but we also know what it has meant.
Mm-hmm. Maybe turn. I know a lot of you want to ask questions as well, so I'll ask one more. So when you showed the picture of the cat and Mondrian together, I would say that part of the abomination of that was that you could still see the cat and you could still see Mondrian, but they were both deeply compromised. And it's very unlike, let's say, the perfection of a child between two people that produces hybrid vigor. And when you actually see the parenting genealogy, you think, I see a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and the outcome is whole, and it has an aura. Whereas actually at the moment, that did not. It felt as an abomination. So I wonder about the question of like the edges and the smoothness between, like how when we think about hybrid vigor or we think about things that have actually become a true third thing.
Well, that Google Deep Dream, the system I used when I did that transformation of the cat is actually technologically obsolete, because that was CNN convolution of 2016. Now it has been upgraded and it works more smoothly.
So we could do it better now.
They can do it, but the spirit of the game has not changed.
Right.
It is the significant difference between the modernist way of combining parts in a collage, cut and paste mode of composition, and the classical idea of merger and transfiguration. I explain that often with a metaphor which comes from cooking. But it may not easily translate. You know the difference between a minestrone and a French potage de légumes mouliné? Now, in a minestrone, the talent of the cook consists on revealing all the ingredients. And you can tell that is a carrot. It's a carrot. There is no way to distinguish. And that is a piece of a celery, and then you can see the beans, etc., etc. The talent, the well-made minestrone, is where all the components can be individuated, and you can tell this is what it is. Now, the talent of someone making a potage de légumes mouliné is that you cannot tell what is in it, because all the ingredients have been transfigured by the processing. You can taste and say, I think there must be this, this, and this. But this is an intuition, is inference. There is no visual evidence. So the postmodernist way of doing cut and paste, we know we can tell this and this and this, assemblage. This is the modernist way. Whereas the classical way, and now the artificial intelligent way, is all about transfiguration and almost transubstantiation.
Right. So where would we predict, if we could predict, this would go? Because, for example, there's a high degree in the studios. If you go look around, there is at this moment there's a lot of this kind of aggregation of pieces and parts that are actually not intentionally not integrated, and that's a look that's become a kind of aesthetic thing, like things akimbo and.
Let's use the word. It's a style.
Okay,
it's
yes. So it's a style. So will we see
now we
stylistically?
Can use the term again,
yeah. Okay, we use the term again. So that style, will we see that will be the dominant style, let's say, of this moment, and then we'll have another style when it's much more like the smoothness of the puree, or is it like where are we going? What is this?
You say puree, you have to use the French term. You cannot say it in an.
We have many French here who will do that better than me. So I'm just thinking about this because I think this is the generation that will be exercising this.
I have friends and colleagues who have been passionate cultivating the style. They didn't use the term. The style of aggregation, the aesthetic of the disjointed meaning. It is a long-standing tradition. It has been revived in the course of the last 5 or 6 years. I know by whom, we know by whom, we know what they were up to, we know also what it symbolizes. It's a style. And now we can actually call it that way. We should thank artificial intelligence for that.
Okay, I'm turning it over to all of you. Questions?
Well, thank you, Mario, for a fascinating lecture, full of insights. I had one remark and then perhaps a question. The remark is, I was wondering sometimes if it may not also be the end of style, because you can very much hybridize a pigeon with a Gothic church, or, a Baroque machine with etc. So, why still stick to a style? Which leads me then to my question, which is that, for Gombrich, but Gombrich in many ways was the last 19th century theorist, style has a social meaning.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether what you're circling around is not the loss of social relevance of style, because style used to be the mediating structure between individual expression and collective recognition, and this is how it's understood mostly in the 19th century. So my question would be, don't you think that it has to do by the end with the underlying, even more than, the change in mimesis, the kind of desocialization of the production?
Well, I wouldn't want to trespass and to go into territories of which I have no understanding. I mean, many art historians have written books on the origin, the rise, and the demise of style, etc., etc. I was just trying to come to terms with the fact that computer scientists felt the need to revive this term unexpectedly, out of the blue. Around 2015, 2016, they were trying to find a term to categorize, to conceptualize what this software was doing. And I know when it's, for the first time, they call this style transfer. It's just anecdotal, just as a footnote. The team of computer scientists who came up with this term in an article published in a Journal of Computer Science in 2016, they were all from Munich, Germany. If you're an art historian, that means something. Perhaps they had... yeah. But without going into the layers of meaning and complicated history of style, etc., I think that what these computer scientists were trying to conceptualize was simply a term which, shorn of, separated from all its art historical meaning, it simply means what a certain corpus of visual representation have in common. It's a purely abstraction, a process of induction. All these look similar. What do they have in common? Let's call it a style, but Vasari would have called it la maniera, because he, for the first time, had to come up with a term to signify that there was something that could be transferred out of a corpus into another one. And so he came up with this term. It is, at the end, probably the reason why computer scientists came up with the resurrection of this term. It is the easiest way to say that this corpus of visual images has something in common, and let's call it a style. This is, I think, what they did, probably because they had all studied some art history in a German gymnasium. Would not have happened. Yeah.
Other questions? Jose?
Hello. Thanks a lot, Mario. It's always super refreshing and enlightening to hear you, and also the way you present your ideas with such clarity. I have a comment or an extension, perhaps, on how you see this story that you told us today.
Otherwise, I don't see you, but you go on.
Okay. Maybe you need the other classes. So, you have presented a vision of how, roughly after the 19th century, this idea of style has been going out of fashion, and by the late 20th century, we don't see style as something that we want to foster with our students, or in architectural practice, you talk about this idea of like imitation as a banned word, right? I would like to offer perhaps an extension of this idea where I am not sure. I think that representation perhaps is good if you think of style as something that represents the collective, like Antoine was saying before. But I think that over the 20th century, you could also see how this idea of style has shifted from an image of the collective to the image of the individual, and how over the 20th century we have grown this culture of shifting the focus from culture to the individual, and this like star architect, the star artist, and how Zaha Hadid buildings look like a Zaha Hadid building, and Frank Gehry's, and it's no wonder why, for example, there are data sets of Zaha Hadid images, and we can create latent space navigation from Gehry images, right? And here in school, we don't tell our students you have to define your own style, but we tell them you have to find your own voice, which is, at the end of the day, just a proxy for that, right?
One of the synonyms I've forgotten.
Yeah.
The voice.
So I wonder if you see this as, well, then maybe we should all be the ones who define our own canon, or maybe the core of the problem that you're trying to portray today is that it's very difficult for us to create our own data sets and therefore use AI in a way that is not replicating someone else's style and therefore someone else's authorship. No one has a problem with generating Gothic images with DALL-E, but if you generate an image from an artist who is alive, then they will sue you or they will give you problems. And that's the core of the problems that we're having today.
It's a very good point that the romantic idea of style was deeply rooted with this collective notion. And the style is the identity of a people, of a country, of a race, of a civilization, of a tradition. There was this collective romantic, whereas in the course of the 20th century, we tend to think of the style as the individual creator. But then, when we switched to that, we stopped using the term style, because style had this romantic connotation. It was linked to this collective patriotic idea, which with modernism, but when we had this idea that each artist has its own voice, we had to find synonyms. The term style, which had probably, you're right, probably because it had this collective, nationalistic, patriotic, popular connotations, no longer apply to the individual style of a single master. Then we had to come to invent synonym. Probably voice. Voice is the best. But one thing for certain, when I was a student in the late 70s, we all knew that we were all doing a mannerism of modernism. But we could not say it. I can conceptualize now, 50 years later, this is what we were doing. But we were shown images of the work of the masters. Why? Because there was this assumption, but by seeing these images, we would learn somehow, magically and mysteriously, to create something which more or less would have to look similar. just bringing in our own voice. But the critical categories that the classical tradition, being a tradition based on the permanent recycling of precedent and elaborated through centuries, this critical capacity, we had already lost it. We could only do things which we could not describe.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. That's a fascinating talk. My question is about if the database, if that's a canon, if it's just the visual aspects that we should concentrate on. I'm thinking of, in some of the historical literature, for example, Katramai, who insisted that we shouldn't take this ideas of like type as visual tropes, but instead think of the system of relations through which these repeat. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on how we might think of the system of relations within the AI, the generating machines, and not just focus on the patterns that it picks out in the visual bits.
That's a very good point, because all this comes from the manipulation of images. It's about image, and so it feeds into image theory. But the same technical logic could apply to all kinds of data sets, which is where it becomes imitation learning, transfer learning, knowledge transfer, et cetera, et cetera. So the example I mentioned, the paper published by Google 1 year ago, is that they trained a machine to look at an operation which was repeated 1 million billion trillion times. It was actually a robot sorting wooden blocks based on color. That was the data set. A robot which was putting all blue, all green, all red in separate piles. And through machine learning, another robot learned to repeat that without any programming. Just in a sense, in the architectural profession, we would call that the transfer of tacit knowledge. But think of what it implies. Think of how much tacit knowledge is inherent in our profession, in our trade, in craft, in every way of making we are familiar with. If this work, this would be a complete upheaval of a scientific positivistic tradition of the way we have been calculating things for the last 250 years. Wait and see. Because to the limit, it could be a case where we have to design a structure which we do not know how to analytically calculate, and we could say, let's create a data set of 1 million billion trillion of similarly built structures that work. And then through machine learning, we shall just replicate it. So the morale would be, when you cannot calculate, imitate. If I were an engineer, and there are some in the room, I don't know how I would like that.
So actually, now you're making me think with this line of thinking that, in fact, the potential for developing discernment will actually become even stronger, because you will be able to produce massive iterations every second, all the time, and the skill will be in extracting the one that is actually the right one for whatever reason. I mean, it reminds me, like, years ago when my sons were in grade school, they had one art teacher who, for whatever reason, had produced absolutely consistent, beautiful work from these 12 children. And you'd wonder, like, I don't really think that all these 12 children are in fact that artistic. But what she was doing was pulling the drawing away at just the right moment. And for each of them, that was different. So she had enough of her of her own ability to realize, okay, stop right there. If I keep going, that's going to get really ugly, or it's going to go south or just go sideways. So she knew exactly when to pull the drawing away and stop it, and it was actually incredibly artistic. So I'm almost wondering now, I was worried that maybe the conclusion is that, oh my gosh, we're lost because we're just. But in fact, maybe what it is that is the discernment becomes the heightened sensitivity.
Yeah. And the process you describe, you may remember it as well, late 90s, when parametricism, we didn't call it that way yet, was creating through parametric variations an unsurmountable amount of similarly irrational. And the problem with Greg Lean and others had it, who chooses the one we want out of these 1 million per second that are churned out by the machine? So at that point, the judgment still has to step in. The process of imitation we are describing is similarly a theoretically endless range of variations, which at some point require some judgment. But the second step of early parametricism was optimization. We introduced a system which, among 1 billion variations, added criteria which would automatically make a choice. So the border of critical judgment keeps shifting, but it's still somewhere.
Okay, one last question. Yeah, Carlo.
Sure. Thank you, Mario, for a fascinating presentation. I was thinking, based on the last comment, nature doesn't calculate. Nature imitates and with some variations. And if you think about architecture before architecture, think about Rudolsky 1972 or architecture without architects, then that was based on a similar process of actually imitation with some variations. So my question is, are we going back to something that's much closer to natural evolution on steroids, much faster?
Well, good point, because the process of optimization is basically a form of digital Darwinism, random variation selection of the fittest. A computer can generate 1 million variation in 1 second, and then we have criteria which choose some, discard others. Nature is slower, but it has had more time to do the same, which is why some say, let's start from what nature has done till now, and let's generate digital variation starting from where nature has got that far. So phase 1, nature has already given that to us. Slower, but over a much longer period of time. Now, we piggyback on that, what computer can do today, faster, but with an amount of time which is, after all, still pretty much limited. But random variation and selection of the fittest is what nature has done over time, and what computational optimization is doing now, with all the sinister connotation that the term implies, evidently. But in mathematical terms, that's the way it works. Yeah.
Okay, one last question. Panagiotis.
Hello, and thank you for the great lecture. So my question has to do with the fact that if we look at neural networks, there is 2 sources of stylistic specificity. One is the imitative source, which comes from the data set, but also there is an intrinsic style that comes from the network architecture, the very way it's wired. And in that way, not all neural networks have the same style of imitating a style, right? So there is a kind of a meta style. Also, I think even architects, when they imitate other architects, they're not all equally good, and they're not doing it in the same way.
Yes, and I've been myself perplexed for the last 4 or 5 years, asking friends who are more technologically oriented than me to explain to me, why is it that all the imitations made by this software look similar? Because there is something happening inside the black box, which makes that if you are technically competent, you can tell these variations were done using that algorithm. And so each one of these algorithmical process leaves its own mark, which is to some extent inevitable. Every tool we use leaves an imprint, which the expert can attribute to the tool it has been used. My guess is that the tools which we have been using, which have been in use for the last 4 or 5 years, are still relatively primitive, hence the mark they leave is more easily discernible, and this will become less manifest in the future, but they will always leave a mark, which the expert person in that software will always be able to detect. This applies to every tool we use, every tool, even a pencil. You can tell you did it with that pencil and not that one. This is to some extent inevitable, but I admit it's very crude in the tools we have been using in the last few years, probably because they are just, we're just beginning. And so it will become less transparent, but still, it's an inevitable component of every feedback loop between tools and users.
Thank you very much for joining us, GSD. Thank you.